because the course I took from you was on generations. There's one specific section where you talked about generations and how different generations think about spirituality. So I was really curious about what led you to like focus in on generational views of spirituality.
Oh yeah, a great question. It came out of I've always been interested in the boomer to Gen X shift. And back then, when Emergent Village was around, and people were writing about ministry to Xers. As an Xer, I'm deep in the Xer generation.
That's right. Yes.
Um, and there's
Yep.
all that. There was a lot of momentum around postmodern ministry, and wasn't mean to reach out to postmoderns. That's probably the initial was attraction, and because I was in campus ministry, campus ministry, you're at the front edge of that cultural shift, right? You're seeing them come, and then it shows up in the church like 10 years later, right? Like you're right there, or five to 10 years later, more fair. Um, so I wanted to, when I got a chance to study at Fuller, I knew I was going to study on leadership development, and I sort of landed on postmodern leadership development. And that was cool because then I got to study under Brian McLaren and Dallas Willard and Bobby Clinton.
Wow.
Eddie Gibbs was my advisor,
Wow.
Reggie McNeil. So, some leadership types. So when I was doing my research, I ran across the work by Strauss and Howe called Generations, which was written in 91, and The Fourth Turning, which was written in 97. And they just had, apparently, I didn't never heard of the book before, but in 91, it was a New York Times bestseller, and Al Gore had bought it for every member of Congress. And it started to get
Amazing.
some notoriety these days because some people in the former administration were using some of the theories. But they came out with this thing to say that in American history, there seems to be a 4-generational cycle that repeats throughout history that has been only broken once, which was during the Civil War, right in the aftermath of the Civil War. It was such a devastating time in our country that's sort of it skipped a generation. But besides that, they sort of trace it all the way back to about I think 1600s, and then work that theory through. And then in 91, when this book came out, the millennials were maybe 8, 9 years old at their oldest at the time when the book came out, but they made guesses of what they would be like as adults based on this theory. And they were, as much as some of their data has been like, they've been accused of like smushing their data into their paradigms, they were spot on about the millennials. They became like the experts of millennials. So they wrote all these other books like Millennials Risings and other things. And that's sort of when I encountered their work. So I thought, hey, if it had, and that's what they say, history is only so good. Your interpretation of history is only so good as its predictive power, which is like, oh, that's good.
Hmm.
So I thought, I'm wondering if there's something here, and spiritually. And part of what they do in this theory is sort of give an attempt at explanation of why a major awakening happens every 80 years. Right? It's because at that point, the prophet generation, which was the boomers, when they're young adults, there's this sort of place where that happens in this generational constellation. It gets complicated, but so in that, I was like, oh, that's fascinating. So let me work that out. And then they had theories about what each generation contributes. What makes their theories a little more robust is most generational theorists sort of talk about the characterizations of a generation and sort of hold that throughout their lifetime. Whereas these guys will say, no, that's actually not true. These generations go through shifts as they go from childhood to young adulthood to midlife to elder. And they operate in different ways at each of these stages. And then it's the constellation of these. Like right now we have boomer elders, Xer midlifers, millennial young adults, and iGen children. That creates a certain constellation, which creates then these kinds of dynamics in the country. So why they've been in the news lately is back in 91, they predicted the great crisis of 2020. Because this would be it's a crisis era, and you can look it up. It actually says the Great Crisis of 2020, and it's they predicted every 80 years is a spiritual awakening, and then every 80 years there seems to be a secular crisis that the whole country has to mobilize around. And the last one would have been World War II. And so they said the Great Crisis of 2020, something that sort of wrecks the whole country, if not the world, that everyone has to rally around while the hero generation, the millennials, are young adults. And so they've been in the news more lately because they kind of called it. And you're like, that's crazy. Even they always sort of disclaim it, like within a year or two or three, it's not exactly 2020, but we just lived through it. So it's there. Um, so I just wondered if there was something spiritual there. And that's actually looking at the core contribution that each generation brings. I sort of brought out of that a spiritual question for each generation and started sort of riffing that around. And it was part of what gained traction as I was just sharing it and teaching it. And back then when I put that stuff into print in 2012, the iGens weren't that old. And so I sort of had to try to make predictions about their spiritual question and where they were going. And now, 9 years later, it feels like it's hitting. Like I was like, oh, hey, thank you,
Mm.
Stress and How. So they don't have to stone me yet. Yeah, you don't have to stone the false prophet yet. So it is, yeah. And so that's where that came out of, and to create then what is the spiritual question each generation brings as their front door spiritual question. And then if you don't answer their front door question, they won't listen to your answers to the other questions. And sort of from that developing, out of that, what I was interested in is how do you share the gospel? How do you do evangelism in that space if that's their spiritual question? And then how do you develop leaders in that space if that's their spiritual question? Because their spiritual question points to their main motivation.
Yeah. Yeah. And you did in your course, you do a dynamic job of like explaining in detail each of these generational views on spirituality and those like gateway questions. Like you're saying, like if that question isn't really addressed, you can't get to all the other questions.
That's right.
So could you like just briefly just share like those main questions for each generation that you kind of studied and wrote about?
Sure. Yeah, the boomers, so born about 43 to 65, um, they ask what is true, because they're the last truly modern generation. Xers, born like that, 64 to 84 ish, they ask what is real. They're all about authenticity, right? And if you know any like people, like what are they, 40s and 50s? That's all we're about. We're the best BS
Mhm.
detectors on the planet, right? Um, then millennials, so born like 81, 2, 3, 4 to 2001, 2. They ask what is good, and they want to know spiritual. How does our faith actually contribute to the good of the world? And I think iGens sort of now, like born what 2000, depending on who you talk to, 99 to 2003. iGens ask what is beautiful, and sort of a corollary to that being what is just, what is a beautiful society. So yeah, what is boomers? What is true? Xers, what is real? Millennials, what is good? And iGens, what is beautiful?
Yeah, those are really, really good questions. And I was going to ask you, so when you look at like uh, Generation Alpha, like your kids coming up, like what kind of spiritual question are you seeing, or what you think might be emerging? Because they're growing up in this time of COVID-19, seeing all the social injustice, increase in xenophobia and racism. They're seeing a different world that I grew up in. And I'm kind of curious, like, as
That's
you're
right.
kind of watching this, maybe
Uh-huh.
what do you kind of maybe predict or are expecting maybe this generation to be asking or be thinking about
Yeah, and
spirituality?
I would still probably put all those kids, like all my kids, under that iGen rubric. I'm calling them iGen. Other people call them
Okay.
Gen Z. I don't know if that's what you meant by Gen Alpha. I haven't heard that yet. Um,
I think it's
if you're
after
talking about them
Generation
younger,
Z. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and so where that boundary line is, not quite sure yet. But these are children that are raised in the crisis era, right? So uh, there's a few things that happen because of that as their children in kind of every generational cycle. I do think like how old? I still think like my 6-year-old is gonna be like tail end of iGen, but so I don't know iGen Alpha if you're talking about the generation after. But
Yes.
I can make
Yes.
predictions. If it's the generation after, they should be more
Yes.
like the boomers, and uh, there'll be a prophetic generation kind of seeking some form of truth or some sort of center that will guide their lives, right? The way that boomers did. But the generation before them, if you still put our children under iGen to some degree, as children of the crisis, they do still ask what is beautiful. They tend to be like people who become the experts. They're the ones who there's lots of stories to share. Like if you go to a birthday party now compared to like 20 years ago, it's totally different, right? Everyone just all the bells and whistles are out these days because now it's like
Yeah.
if someone comes over and you give them mac and cheese, people are like, you could have looked up a recipe on the internet, you lazy girl. That kind of business.
Yeah.
So the access to technology,
Right.
they tend to do things well, and from a young age, they've got the phones that can do cinema quality movies and computers that can do studio quality music. They're on a different level. So in the place to be experts, they tend to also become, if generational theory holds, experts at process. They tend to be good government officials. They tend to be the ones who kind of, if millennials were doers, then iGens are improvers, and they sort of take things to the nine. If millennials were like practical, like how do we do good in the world? How do we change the world? Any message like change the world, right? It's that mid-20s to that 20, 30 something.
Right.
That's super exciting.
Yeah.
But if they're about that, the millennials, I'm sorry, the iGens are much more about personal fulfillment / chasing the ideal. So it's practical in one sense because they tend to be more career oriented and more risk averse. But what they're chasing is what's worthy of worship, right? In a place where they can get products that are perfect, like grooming products for men. It's insane right now, right? Like if you're a hipster plaid wearing bearded dude, all the things you could spend hundreds of dollars on this.
On your beard.
Making that terminal length, whatever. I'm Asian. I don't get the terminal length, but that's how people go to extremes. So what's the perfect life? What's the ideal life to live? What's an ideal community? And of course it's inclusive, right? That's sort of the buzz today. And those kinds of things will kick in. And the way it affects ministry today, right, is like that desire for the ideal life or ideal day kicks in so hard that they don't want to make a commitment to something. Like, let's say, come to our Friday gathering. And it's Monday. Well, like, hey, I can't really commit right now because I don't know what else might show up on Friday. That could be a better thing. So if before you had FOMO, like fear of missing out, this generation is FOBO, right? Fear of better options. Right?
I like that.
It's hard to connect. I got that from Mark Sayers. It's hard for people. We're finding one of our strategies on campus sometimes is just like make it seem spontaneous. So it's strategic and intentional, but you put the chairs out on the walk and go like, hey, we're having Bible study now, come on over. And like at that point, it's like, well, I don't have anything better to do. This is the better life.
Yeah.
That's an easier way to get people than trying to get them to commit to something ahead of time. So
that's so interesting.
Ideal. And, if you come to a church and they don't seem like they're trying, unfortunately, like artistically, they're just no one uses overheads anymore, but their PowerPoints are janky or something. They're like, I could do better on my phone. I could do something right now. Can we work on this? I think so. All that because they're experts and tend to know processes and actually are really good at being inclusive with people and how to get people along. They're just super savvy that way. Just like the silent generation, like my parents, relationally savvy, right? I think then getting them to co-create and co-lead with you early, since they're already doing it in these other spaces, is key. Don't try to do it for them. You'll never get to their level. Involve them, get them to lead it. They're going to be way savvier and inclusive in helping people through than you are. And how do we empower them to co-create with us since they're so good at creating? And then I think because what is a beautiful society is also a just one. They will have that sense, like who's left out, who in this process, who's being marginalized, who's centered, who's not centered. Those kinds of that thing will play out. And so really helping them co-lead these processes will really help any community be the kind of community that can be welcoming. So yeah, that's the thing. Now, for people who are older than iGens, they seem really sensitive. iGens seem like really, like there's a level of frustration that I think particularly Xers will feel about. So maybe Xers, maybe boomers. Like, are you serious? We got to go through that process too. Why don't we just make a decision? Um, but really, they're so good at it. They are going to be they're going to be the grease to community wheels and helping it move forward. Getting them involved early and often is usually a win.
As you think about like raising your kids, and I'm curious, like I like that you said like bringing them in, like let them co-own things with you.
Oh
As
yeah.
you think about raising your kids, whether it's like projects at home, chores, or even spirituality, what are some ways that you would tell parents on how they can help to include their kids in on these different areas so that they can kind of grow and be nurtured?
Oh, that's fantastic. And I am not a perfect dad. So, I could work on patience and other things. But I think one thing I do try to do and do decently is whenever I'm doing something, there's an invitation. So, like if I'm fixing a speaker or set, like I just tried to fix my speakers, then I'll bring my son over and just anybody who's willing to be with me, I'll give them the job that they can handle. Like if it's just unscrewing something, go for it. If it's something more, go for it. If it's holding something while I'm soldering, that's there. Um, so, and what's neat is, so my son, my oldest, has some spiritual sensitivities and leadership, and so he helped plant a ministry at his middle school before the pandemic,
Really?
right? And they had like 30 people showing up each week. It was awesome. Um,
Wow.
so, and he has these kinds of verbal gifts. Like I saw him speak in front of the school board. And so I'm there, right, at a fifth grade representative. This is 3 years ago. He was the representative for a school to speak in front of the school board. So I went with him. And as he's going up, I go, dude, Ice, where's your notes? He goes, don't need them, Pops. And just goes up
What?
extemporaneously, tells a joke, has the board laughing, and then, has him going. I have parents leaning to me like, you got a special one there, like, so he's got something there. So when one rhythm we had before the pandemic was we would serve at a soup kitchen about once a month or once every 5, 6 weeks. And I just, again, have the kids involved. They're serving. We're doing this together. We're not solving all their problems, but it's just a way to love, right?
Yeah.
It was my turn to give a devotion. Actually, anytime I'm there, they want me to give the devotion. So great. I love it. The scariest audience for me, right? Because I'm super aware of my privilege. I'm trying not to preach a message that's middle class to people, like won't sound like good news. But it's been great. There's been a rapport, and it's really been fun. And I hope they're, I'm helping. But at one point, I was about to give it, but my son had prepared a devotional that he couldn't give because there was a scheduling mix-up at his middle school group. So I just go, I let them know ahead of time. They're like, but not much, like about 30 minutes ahead. I was like, you're going to give the devotion today. And he goes, really? I'm like, yeah, go for it, man. And he gave the devotion to like 40 homeless folks
What?
and plus the 15 volunteers from our church.
Beautiful.
48 people.
Wow.
And he binged it. He was nervous and but
Oh,
the best part of that then you've got the friends who live outside as well as our church people coming up to him afterward and going like, great talk, so helpful, like giving him all kinds of encouragement because he's
oh,
13, right? So they're going to do that. And what's that going to do for my son? Like, oh, I can contribute, right? Like I've got a place in the kingdom. And that's, if I can just shift my kids from being consumers to being people who contribute, right? Then I feel like they're closer. They're closer to what this kingdom's about. So I'm just looking for that. They still consume. There's still things they do, but as much as I can try to bring them into my world or my thinking or creating with me. So like, yeah, and that's true. Even with family rhythms, we have a family meeting, our family meeting. Whereas because we're so critical of each other, the first half is just encouragements, like no criticism. Everyone gets encouragement from everyone. And then the second half is working through rhythm. So Mom and I think you guys are playing too many video games. You guys want to play more. Can we talk about a good schedule that will work for us? Right? And we just start to bring them in. But we're thinking this, we're thinking that, and that way just help them co-create the rhythms so they can own some of them as well. And they're thoughtful, right? And they know what we want. They know if they scream about what they want, but we have to learn to listen to each other to get to a place where we're getting there. And it's helpful for me and Ginny to learn to listen to our kids. We need that rhythm too. So it's it doesn't always work out, but a lot of times that helps us get to some place that we all own, and less fighting when we actually enforce. So we we're still looking for ways. If we can do it together and they're contributing to it, they'll also not only get a chance to co-create with us, they'll probably own it more.
I love that. And I feel so bad. We're like already up at our hour, but I wanted to ask you one other question about your
Okay.
kids, because right now with the amount of specifically anti-Asian racism that started
Okay.
at the beginning of COVID, and I'm just wondering like, what advice would you give for parents who have children of color, as we're seeing increase in racism during this time and
Oh, yeah.
violence,
Yeah.
how to parent and be there for our kids?
Yeah, it can be a scary time, especially if we just let them watch the news a lot. It's a great question. I hope we're doing a good job at it, particularly as an Asian parent, as a minority in this country. There's two extremes that I'm trying to avoid, right? So one is like ethnic pride, everyone else sucks, which Koreans can do. We have a joke of being the chosen generation, but there's also a Joseon dynasty, so you can pun it and yeah, we're chosen. Um, but then there's the other extreme where we get into like a self-deprecating, our ethnicity is like in the way, and so then to avoid that kind of victim mentality, the ways we'll cope with that is either we wallow in it or we just avoid our ethnic identity altogether. So we're trying to hold this between the ethnocentrism and the self-deprecation. How do we create a healthy ethnic identity that's woven into faith? And I just think that's true. I think that's part of identity, that we don't let the ethnic markers sort of take over our spiritual identity, but it informs it. You know the cultural background of every character in the Bible, every major character in the Bible. And if you don't know, they'll tell you Uriah the Hittite, right? Like they're gonna let you know. It's a key part of our story and how we engage the bigger story of God. So I think in that way, then I want them to know that their heritage is good. And so we'll do things that are like pro Korean, and so they'll have different things, but just allowing the culture to have its place and to say that God didn't make a mistake when he made us Korean Americans. And then second from there, to say like, if people, I think we just need a base there to say how God created us wasn't a mistake. So then we can address, but see, there's broken people and people are saying lots of crazy stuff. It doesn't define us, doesn't define who we are, but it's out there. So how would we respond the way Jesus would want us to respond? Because we could get judgy in this house a little bit, and so we have to figure out
Sure.
how to navigate that. So it's conversations, and at different stages of their lives, what we have been active about is saying that ethnic identity matters. And I think that's true, whether you're white or Native American or black or Latino, whatever is your story, like, are there ways that we can allow God to help us glory in the parts of the story we're supposed to, and not get just stuck in a rut? So um, we tried to be that. And oh, actually, so there's this book on parenting by Burl Bronson. What's it called? I can see the cover, this egg. We'll have to look it up somewhere. But each chapter is like based on research. It's sort of like a Malcolm Gladwell take-ish on parenting. And it takes like based on data, sort of a counterintuitive idea, and then then makes it accessible. And in one of their chapters on race, they basically say, do you want to raise a racist kid? You know what's the best way to raise a racist kid? Is don't talk about race with them. Just don't talk about race or ethnicity until they're 9 years old. Because at 9 years old, their views on race and ethnicity harden. And if you're not bringing stuff up with them, they're learning it on the side, right? So they know the difference between Asian and black, unless they can't, they'll know the difference. So if you don't help them and be explicit about that difference, then explicit about the differences and what's the same and what is the difference, then they grow up more racist, which is just flies in the face of like the way most white liberal parents will raise their kids. Like, there is no race, there's no ethnicity. We see each other all the same, right? Like, no, you have to bring it up, and you have to go like, our Puerto Rican neighbors, right? Like, they either love Jesus as much as we do, or there's nothing about them that's inherently less than us, and there's nothing about us that's inherently more than them. You have to actually be explicit and say it for them to get it. And so I think more than anything is bring it, let it be there. Don't push it down. If your kid says something racist, don't like just jump all over them and say like, that's racist. Don't talk about race in front of people. That's just racist to do that. It creates a complex, and then they don't know how to talk about these things. It's just a place for us to talk through that. And if you want a sort of a biblical lens on ethnic identity, I can't recommend enough a book called Beyond Colorblind by Sarah Shin. She was one of my old students, former InterVarsity staff, so I love it. And she takes basically our gospel, the way we share the gospel in InterVarsity, the big story, and then helps see ethnic identity through that lens. So how is our ethnic identity created for good, damaged by evil, restored for better, and sent together to heal? And how does ethnic identity help us do that? And I do think the more we own our ethnic identity, the more we'll be equipped to do racial reconciliation and justice work in the future. And that if we don't address it in ourselves, then we'll usually either make a mess, or we may end up making a mess. There's no or. Owning where we're coming from. It's the self-awareness with the ethnic lens in our leadership, which will help us become more multi-ethnic and agents of justice and reconciliation when called to it.
Hey, thank you so much for checking out this video clip from the Delgado podcast. To get more videos like this, simply subscribe here on YouTube. You can also download the full episode of each show on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or your favorite podcast player. Take care.